years old as a program. So, yay, we made it. We're very proud of that. And getting better and hopefully more enjoyable also for you all the time. We are starting, as always, every DMSA day starts with the guest. This year's guest is a partnership which is called Liminal, a partnership of an architect and a composer. These kind of collaborations are still quite rare. Composers, architects, they have to find a common language in order to work together. So they are pursuing the adventure of sound and space. The partnership is represented by the composer part, David Pryor. We are very happy to have him here. We would have liked to get Francis Crowe as well, but you know the finances at uni very tight. But we are very happy to have David here, and I hand over to him, and he will explain everything. So we will enjoy for an hour David talking about his work.
Thanks very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you particularly to Kersten for inviting me. It's really nice to be here in a great space, which seems to have amazing sound installation going on in the corner. It's lovely, lovely noises. Quite often buildings have nasty noises going on in them, like nasty air conditioning, but that's kind of intriguing. I don't know what that is. So I'm, as Kersten said, I'm half of Liminal. Francis can't be here today. But we both work independently of each other, but we've been working together as Liminal, sort of exploring the relationship between sound and space. It's not, Francis as an architect doesn't necessarily mean that everything we do is to do with the built environment or to do with looking at the relationship between sound and buildings, albeit that that is one of the themes that we're very interested in. But a more accurate catch-all for what we do, I suppose, is the relationship between sound and space, and I think everything we do is, in one way or another, an exploration of that theme. So I'll say a bit as I talk about the projects, maybe about how that works in terms of the fact that we have very different skill sets, slightly different sensitivities, although we've been working together a long time now, so I guess we tend to think quite similarly. I think we first worked together in 1996 for this piece for the South Bank Centre. It was quite a naive project, but I'm still rather fond of it. We were given access to 3 levels of the South Bank Centre. The upper bit, which is not normally open to the public, actually, I think it's been closed off now. And then this stairwell that links through to the main concourse. And then in the basement, as probably many of you know, is where all the skateboarders hang out. So we used the 3 levels trying to articulate those 3 different spaces, both the architectural contours of those spaces and also their use with 3 linked sound installations. This is the one on the roof. That's the one in the undercourse. I've brought an image of the one in between. But they were supposed to be kind of drawing out the properties that were there anyway, drawing out the sounds that were there anyway, but somehow mediating with what was there to make simple, in that case, very primitive for us, mediations into those spaces. We've since we've done quite a lot of projects together, ranging from images about sound to narratives in sound to mediations in acoustic environments, changing the acoustics passively, to a lot of work that in one way or another uses phonography, the art of sound recording, quite often linearly, quite often in fixed media pieces, but sometimes also using interactive media. And I thought rather than going through and spending a short amount of time on lots of pieces, I'm going to spend this time mainly just talking about 2 pieces that in some ways are perhaps representative of the different sorts of projects that we do. One of them is a piece from a couple of years ago now called Organ of Corti, which is a purely acoustic mediation. There's no technology involved in it as such, although there was a lot of technology involved in developing it. So I'm going to put that under the bracket of a kind of post-digital work. It relies entirely on digital technology, but its manifestation actually has no technology in it. And the other one I'm going to talk about really because it's in development, so I thought that might be interesting to talk about. Unfortunately, that means I don't have all the media that I would like to have to show you. We're right in the middle of it, and we've just developed it on a residency in Portugal, and that one relies very heavily on sound recording. The other thing that I do under the banner of Liminal, which sort of goes along in the background and kind of funds our artistic work, is sound design for film and particularly for exhibitions, which I'm not going to talk about, but I'll just spin through a few of things. Again, though, the theme of the articulation of space through sound is always the bottom line as to why I've been asked, I suppose, to get involved in those places. This is the Church of Warhams in London, New York Historical Society in New York, Guinness in Dublin, Jefferson in Museum in Virginia, and so on. But I'm going to just skip through those because I want to start talking about Organ of Corti, just briefly on the way, mentioning the other sorts of funny things where our collaboration expands. So this is a piece in the Cotswold Water Park, which is a collaboration with the poet Larry Lynch, with this kind of quasi-Mesostic poem. And it's actually a bird hide, a bird box, with a very, very low-powered loudspeaker in that lower ring that just invites you into the world of the nesting bird. Again, a very sort of simple intervention into the environment in green oak. I only paused on that one because it's a bit anomalous, I suppose, that one for us. Anyway, on to Organ of Corti. I'll briefly explain what this piece is, sort of what its fabric is, how it works, and then play a short movie that explains it with Frances' voice, as her telepresence can be here. She's only 2.5 minutes or so. And then talk about the process, really, that led up to it, which is vital for the fact that it existed in the end, obviously. But it came out of a different project, really, so I think that might be worth talking about. That will invoke the theme of collaboration and some of the things that went into making it. But these are some visualizations of it before it was built, and you can see that it exists in these two forms, long, thin, and a short, fat. And I'll just draw your attention to the dots on the floor. They represent a pathway. So the idea is that these are 96 3-meter long transparent tubes mounted vertically, and you walk through it. And it's placed in the environment in noisy locations, and it takes that noise and recycles it. It doesn't make any noise of its own at all, which is kind of fundamental to us conceptually. It merely mediates what's there already. And what it does is to filter through these tubes the incoming sound according to a principle nicknamed sonic crystals. Actually, the crystal is a bit of a misnomer, nothing crystalline about it, but it's based on an acoustic phenomenon that's rather infant at the moment and is being developed in about 3 or 4 acoustics research centres around the world. And they're looking at very pragmatic applications for it. They're seeing that you have a very effective noise barrier that isn't actually a solid barrier. So that obviously leads to some interesting applications such as road traffic barriers and so on. But they discovered a problem that we became very intrigued about, in that the more effective it is at reducing a particular band of frequencies, the more that either side of the frequency band that you're reducing, you get ringing tones. And so you can be quite dramatic in the effect that it has, but then you create these kind of resonance effects either side, which if you're making a noise barrier, is a real problem, because you might be causing more problems than you're solving. But for us, that became the kind of point of departure for the piece, to try and work with choosing frequencies to filter, and then working with those ringing tones to, if you like, make a passive synthesizer. It's using the principle that subtractive electronic synthesis uses. You start with a big block of noise, and filter it down. It would be misleading for me to claim that it's as effective as an electronic filter. It's rather more subtle than that. But the effect of walking through it is one of kind of mediating the sound which is already there, but hearing it in a new way. And the reason that it's in two configurations is dependent on the environment that it's in. So in this square configuration there, we were anticipating using that in an environment where the noise is all around you. I've got some images of the tour that it did later. So for instance, that was used just outside St Paul's Cathedral, where the noise was rather omnidirectional. And the other one was placed next to noise sources like road traffic, where all the noise was on one side, or running water. In fact, at St Paul's, most of the noise was on one side, but because of the fact that there were buildings behind it, there was almost as much reflective sound coming in as there was from the side of the noise source, so it was more effective to do it that way. So I'll briefly talk about the physics behind it. I'm not going to claim to be an expert at all in this, but the story goes that some acousticians in Madrid had noticed the peculiar properties of this sculpture, which was not intended to have any acoustic effect. The sculpture is a minimalist sculpture by Semper, and as far as we know, he had no acoustic intentions for it. But they noticed that when you spoke on one side, the attenuation on the other side was much greater than could be explained by the mass of the tubes themselves. And they wondered whether something else was going on, other than simply the barrier effect that you would expect of the mass of those tubes. So they did some tests and worked out that indeed noise was sound waves were sort of being trapped, to put it in very layperson's terms, on the journey that they took through this lattice of tubes, which is not a phenomenon that had been explored before in acoustics. It is a phenomenon that's very well understood at other frequencies of vibration, in light, for instance, and in microwaves. People have known about this for a very long time. So I suppose hypothetically they've known that it must work on sound waves too, but I suppose nobody had bothered to really look at what the applications of that might be. So here's an animated GIF showing the effect, and you can see that it's not hugely dramatic. It doesn't block out the sound altogether, but the route that the sound wave takes through, and this is a plan of organ of Corti, you can see what's going on. So you can see on the right hand side that we have a decibel scale where the red is loudest and blue is quietest. That should be enough to kind of understand what's going on. This has no sound, it's just showing you a sound wave emanating and its behaviour when it hits the structure. So it still passes through. It reflects quite considerably. You can see on the other side it's attenuated a lot. So I suppose what this came down to for us was a notion I didn't capture, and unfortunately I didn't come up with this term, hearing steering. I wish I had, but I wrote an article on it for a journal, and the editor said, "Oh, that's great, hearing steering. That could be a really nice new thing for you in your practice." I thought, yeah, I wish I'd thought of it, but that is exactly what it is. It's about taking something which is there already and mediating it so that we can listen to things that we're already familiar with in new ways. And I'll come on to why that was particularly interesting to us when I talk about the research behind it. This is the short movie I mentioned there, and this just gives a brief introduction to the themes and also some images of the concepts in which we presented it. There should be sound.
Organ of Corti by Liminal, winner of the PRS Foundation New Music Award 2010, is an experimental instrument.
It doesn't normally do that. Sounds like... Should I just try it again, or?
Organ of Corti by Liminal, winner of the PRS Foundation New Music Award 2010, is an experimental instrument that recycles noise from the environment. It does not make any sound of its own, but rather it attempts to draw our attention to the sounds already present by framing them in a new way. Named after the organ of hearing in the inner ear, it uses the acoustic technology of sonic crystals to accentuate or attenuate frequencies within the broad range of sound present in road traffic or falling water. By recycling surplus sounds from our environment, we hope to challenge expectations of what might constitute a piece of music, by adding nothing to the existing soundscape, but rather offering new ways of listening to what is already there. We hope that this instrument might be a device that rematerializes our experience of sound, inviting us to listen to ourselves listen. In the summer of 2011, Organ of Corti toured England to 4 locations saturated in noise from road traffic or falling water. Organ of Corti recycles sounds in the environment by filtering incoming sound waves through a lattice of 4-meter high acrylic cylinders, known as a sonic crystal array. Depending on a listener's position in relation to the array, the structure attenuated or accentuated areas of the frequency spectrum to create an evolving sound environment that relied entirely on the sound energy already present in the place in which it was installed. In a world saturated with sounds, the Organ of Corti questions whether we need any more noise and instead offers a frame through which to listen to the sounds that already surround us.
So, that gives you some sense of its context. It won the PRS Foundation New Music Award in September 2010. So technically the project occurred over the year following that, because that was where the funding came from. But in fact, it would have been impossible to make it in that time. And there's a backstory that goes back another 2 years, actually, as to why we came up with the idea of doing it in the first place, and where some of the themes that became important to us kind of evolved. And that goes back to a research project that we did, which was funded by the Wellcome Trust, where we put together a multidisciplinary team to look at the relationship between sound, health and well-being. The Wellcome Trust are particularly, well, they only really fund projects to do with biomedicine, health and well-being, and the relationship that has to other things. And we thought it would be interesting to bring together people who listen professionally, but listen with completely different sets of tools. I don't just mean physical tools, but different sets of trainings and sensitivities, different attitudes to why they're listening and what they do. So we had Professor Sue Denham, who's a neuroscientist who specialises in listening and speech and music from the University of Plymouth. We had Greg Watts, who's a professor of acoustics at Leeds University with a particular specialism in road transport noise and environmental acoustics. We had Seb Johan, who is a commercial acoustician, worked at the time for Arup, who was on the team to help us oralise potential futures. So we'd come up with ideas, and the Arup Sound Lab could simulate them effectively. Although that presented an interesting problem when we came on to doing this. And we also had Amora El Rafai, who's a clinician, who's an audiologist at the University of Bristol, and we were working in partnership with Sustrans, the Sustainable Transport Charity. So they were the only ones who weren't professional listeners, but were vital to the project going ahead. And in the end, these sites were significantly chosen according to those routes. That team was later augmented with another acoustics person, Professor Keith Attenborough, who was a specialist actually in the technologies that we're using. That proved significant because the modelling techniques that tend to be used in acoustic oralizations tend to, I think up until now, actually, they've built into them knowledge and understanding of the way in which sound bounces off surfaces and the way in which sound is absorbed by surfaces. That's understood in a very sophisticated way, and that understanding goes back over a century now. But those models don't really deal with the way in which sound bends around objects. And they knew that there were shortcomings in their models, that they'd come across it, for instance, when they were designing theatres, and they put an orchestra pit under the stage, and the sound coming out from under the orchestra pit was being bent around, the waves were being bent around the route it took from the pit to the audience. But it was completely impossible to model the behaviour of organ of Corti because of the fact that the effect on the listener is entirely to do with the bending of the sound waves and nothing at all to do with absorption and reflection. So with this team, we were kind of interested in how our practices related to one another. How might the auralization techniques used for demonstrating the acoustic behaviour of an unbuilt building be of use to an artist, or help a cognitive neuroscientist in the study of audio perception? How might listening exercises devised for the study of music be of use to acousticians, more accustomed to relying on technology in the analysis of a site? How might artist techniques in site analysis be of use to architects and acousticians, or vice versa? How might techniques developed for the diagnosis of tinnitus or other hearing problems be applied to an analysis of the quality of a given environmental soundscape? So between us, the team represented expertise and specialism concerning that whole journey of sound. And you could say we had people whose principal concern was to do with that physical bit in the air of compression and rarefaction, the acousticians and the musicians, through to people that were more expert, the audiologists, in the mechanical transfer of sound in the inner ear. Audiologists don't tend to know that much about acoustics. They don't tend to know that much about neuroscience either. Their bit is about the mechanical function in the ear. Moving on to the neuroscientists with expertise in what happens after that mechanical transfer in the inner ear as sound becomes data again and moves on up the brainstem. Of these specialists, both acousticians and audiologists are often employed to correct problems, dealing with unwanted noise, either in the environment, in the case of the acoustician, or in the head, in the case of audiologists. Physiological problems that impede the reception of sound, or in the case of things like tinnitus, create unwanted sound, often connected with hearing loss and other things. This became our point of departure for the prototype of the organ of Corti. We decided what we wanted to do was make a listening aid that, unlike a hearing aid, is not correcting a physiological problem in the ear, but is perhaps correcting a neurological one or a cultural one of being bombarded with sound all the time. And as sound artists, we are guilty of putting more sound into the sound environment quite a lot of the time. What we want to do with this piece is not put any more sound in, but create a device that might stimulate listening, a listening aid. Playfully addressing this theme, hopefully, of unwanted sound in the environment and in the head, rather than in a doctrinaire way, I suppose. It wasn't a statement to do with acoustic ecology per se. It was more of a sort of playful take on what a listening aid might be. So on this quest, we became interested in the physiology and the neuroscience of hearing, and in particular, this process which I'm still really intrigued by, that sound is physically mapped according to its frequency along the length of the basilar membrane, which is this little organ in your inner ear, referred to as the organ of Corti. So that literally means if you were to, don't do it, but if you were to break open your ear and unravel the basilar membrane, you'd get this long gooey thing. I'm not sure how long it is actually, but at one end it's sensitive to low frequencies, and at the other it's sensitive to high frequencies, and the hair cells vibrate in response to those incoming frequencies. And once they have been stimulated in that way, the data remains physically separated as it goes on up through the brainstem. A very interesting and poetic idea, we thought. And our original idea was to somehow build this on an architectural scale. And I don't think it's any coincidence, maybe it is a coincidence, I don't know, that organ of Corti looks somewhat like this, and that the physics of sonic crystals have this kind of peculiar relationship to this image. In fact, organ of Corti doesn't quite behave like this. It's not sensitive to low frequencies at one end and high at the other, but it does, in other ways, map some of the behaviour of hair cells in the inner ear. So it was a kind of poetic point of departure, if not a literal one. So we became fascinated that, like so many animals, our auditory system is predicated on this physical separation of sound into space. And that was a really intriguing proposition, that we could scale that up to an architectural scale. The other thing that organ of Corti does do is behave a little bit like, so the phenomena of acoustic sonic crystals generally does behave like the basilar membrane, in that if you were to damage a portion of this, say the middle bit, you create a band gap. So that gap would be a gap that you wouldn't be able to hear anymore. And a little bit like an amputee who suffers pain in a missing limb. Some of the explanations of tinnitus is that the hair cells either side of the damaged area are working overtime to make up for the data that they're not receiving. And that produces these spurious sounds that we call tinnitus. Somewhat like pain, pain being caused by healthy cells near the amputated region working overtime and producing this spurious pain that doesn't actually exist from a physical cause. And this phenomenon of the frequencies either side of a removed band gap resonating seems to have some kind of relationship with that, with the way in which the basilar membrane works. So organ of Corti makes no sound of its own, which as a musical proposition obviously has antecedents in John Cage and his legacy, and in broader artistic terms can be seen as part of a response to artists like Duchamp and the notion of the ready-made. However, while individual visitor experiences of organ of Corti are defined by their proximity and orientation to the structure, and although the sounds that they hear are present in the environment already, organ of Corti for us wasn't primarily about ideas of authorship, although it does sort of play on those themes a little bit. Rather, we were more interested in another theme that is a concern within the materiality of sound itself. So we're interested in this idea of sound materially rather than indexically. I think as the sound arts grow into maturity, we see those different traditions emerging. So on the one hand, you have electroacoustic music, musique concrète, which is all about the materiality of sound, and not really about its indexicality at all. It's not intended to be, even if it is by mistake. On the other hand, we have traditions of sound art which have really dealt with sound much more symbolically and much more to do with the cultural resonances that sound produce. And I suppose I'm interested in both, but you have to kind of nail your colours to the mast with each piece that you make and explore one theme rather than the other, perhaps. So this is very much not about that kind of indexical route, but much more to do with exploring the materiality of sound. In that, I suppose I have been for a long time, we both are really interested in the work of James Turrell, sometimes referred to as a sculptor, sometimes referred to as a light artist, which I think is an interesting description, timely at the moment with the show on at South Bank. He once described his light sculptures as provocations to the viewer to look at himself or herself looking, to look at oneself looking. And in this, one of his Skyscape Space series, this one's in the Yorkshire Deer Shelter, Yorkshire Sculpture Park, Deer Shelter, Turrell mediates our experience of the sky simply by offering us a new frame through which to view it. And this act of framing something ephemeral, of intervening only in the context of our looking and not in the material of the thing viewed, is important to the reflexive intent of this collection of his pieces. Rather than offering us the opportunity to view something new, Turrell offers us the opportunity to view something already familiar in a new way. He reminds us that the phenomenon we're observing is, of course, always changing, always new, and in so doing, he suggests a reconsidering of the act of looking itself. But if the ready-made challenged the notion of the art object, it nevertheless did so by means of more objects. Rather than presenting us with a ready-made object, Turrell turns our attention away from a discourse concerned with authorship towards the corrective of another grand oversight in the canon of Western art culture, the materiality of light itself. I just want to read a quote of his. He says, in my work, I feel my work is using the material of light to affect the medium of perception. I'm using light in its material aspect. I try to take light and materialize it in its physical aspect so that you really feel it. Feel it physically. Feel its physicality. Feel the response to temperature and its presence in space, not on a wall. And that became, I suppose, an interesting quote for us in terms of what we were trying to do with Organ of Fortune. There's a quote here that, well, I'll let you read it. I think right back when we were working very early on in our practice together, we latched on to this quote from Experiencing Architecture, Rasmussen. Kind of putting this collection of ideas together and trying to materialize them through sound. Of course, there are wonderful precedents within sound art itself. One of the most obvious would be the work of Alvin Lucier. Much of his work materializes sound and materializes our relationship with sound. I don't know how familiar you all are with his body of work. This one, Music on a Long Thin Wire, has the components of a loudspeaker kind of in utero. So the loudspeaker is exploded and all its parts are stretched across a room. So you have, it's difficult to get the scale of that, but it's a very large horseshoe electromagnet with a wire passing through it. So the wire is in a magnetic field. And then a simple tone is passed into the wire, which is more or less what's happening with a loudspeaker. You have a coil of wire put into a magnetic field, and in a conventional loudspeaker you play the music into that wire and it sets the wire oscillating, and the paper cone then sort of amplifies that so that we can hear it. So what you'd expect to hear through that, and something special about that system, is whatever you play into the wire is going to get louder, and indeed it does. And one end of the wire is stretched over a double bass bridge to help with the amplification, and that has a little pickup on it, an electronic pickup to amplify it. And you hear what's played in, which would be, you usually use as a simple sine tone. But because the wire is stretched across the room, it behaves like all wires do. It behaves like all tubes do. It can produce the entire harmonic series, so it becomes sensitive to the things that happen in the room. So tiny vibrations or changes in temperature and humidity act on the wire, so that what we actually hear is much more complex than the tone going in. It becomes something responsive to its environment. It reveals things about the space in which it's situated that you wouldn't normally have access to. And many of his pieces do that in different ways. Very briefly, I'll just mention a student of mine. He's long into his own professional career now. A guy called Yazin Clark. He did a piece when I was teaching at Dartington in a field where he placed, I still think this is one of the most beautiful post-Lucerian pieces I've ever come across. He placed drummers, snare drummers, at distances away from an audience who are standing where we are. And he, as you saw in the previous picture, is conducting them with a semaphore flag. And they are all playing in time with this flag, because they can see him and they all hit their drums together. But because of their distance from us, they create rhythms, because of the time it takes for the sound to reach our ears. So in another way, to Lucy, he's materialised an aspect of sound that we don't normally have access to. So, for our listening aid to genuinely be an aid to listening, we felt that rather than designing a device that would create new sounds, we needed a device that would encourage the reconsideration of sounds already present. Like Terrell, we would intervene only in the context of our listening and not in the materiality of the thing heard. Of course, all architecture does that to a degree, which is why that Rasmussen quote was useful. And architecture designed particularly with its acoustic behaviour in mind, such as concert halls, for instance, do that more specifically. But I don't think it's the same. While there are architectural spaces that draw our attention to the act of listening, architecture primarily designed for the performance of other sounds, whether as music or some other anticipated sounding event, sound art or theatre or anything else, fall outside what we were thinking of as a listening aid, albeit that they might function as one. I have once or twice gone to concert halls, for instance, because I've heard that they sound amazing, because I want to hear them, what they sound like. Or people that visit the Whispering Gallery in St Paul's Cathedral, they are visiting it partially because of the way it sounds, but kind of, although they may function as listening aids, as according to that criteria that we put forward, most of them aren't designed with that intention in the first place. So unlike a concert hall, Organ of Corti is not so much designed as a frame within which to contemplate sound, or the internal relationships between sounds, or the agency of the person making them, but as a frame through which to contemplate the act of listening itself. And we need to really zoom along, I think. I'll just show a couple of images. That was a prototype that we built, we tested on a wing where we live. And then there are some images from its tour in London. And then Tebay Gorge in Cumbria, where the noise source now was very different. London didn't work very well, actually, I think because the sounds were much too articulate in their own right. The effects of the structure, as I said, were somewhat subtle and lent itself much better to continuous noise, where you knew that the noise you were listening to was constant and unchanging and somewhat inarticulate. Then the effect was, I think, for me, certainly more interesting. And in Tebay, we were right up a hill, a little way away from the motorway, which formed the noise source. You've seen some of these images in the video anyway, so I'll skip through them. I think also as a work of public art, it had to work on a number of different levels. It was intriguing at these different sites. Acousticians were coming because they were intrigued by its behaviour, and sound art people were coming because they were interested in what we were doing conceptually, I suppose. But it had to also function in this way to be just something that was kind of cool to climb on. I think the last installation for us was the most successful, which was in Worcester, where the noise source, rather than being traffic, all the others were traffic. Even the Cotswold Water Park one in the lake was actually also traffic because it was near the A419, which is, I think, the noisiest road in Europe because it has a concrete surface. And that wasn't a coincidence. That site also came out of a previous project that we'd done, where we were involved in a master plan for the Cotswold Water Park, just sort of trying to brand itself as a holiday destination. And they show images of it being lovely and peaceful and tranquil. Visually it is, but it's incredibly noisy. So placing it there became a kind of, again, a sort of playful provocation of the disparity between what the place looked like and what it sounded like. That's Worcester. So I think I better leave Organ of Corti there. And just, so it ended up in Poltimore House near Exeter, where it kind of finished its tour, and we did bits and pieces there. But I'm going to move on to How long have I got, Kirsten? Oh, quiet. Or anyone?
40 minutes.
Pardon?
40 minutes.
40 more minutes?
Or 30 minutes.
Oh, right. I thought, yeah, maybe I'm rushing a bit too. I'll finish the conclusion. I've got that long. No, I'll zoom on. So, this piece of this parish is in progress, and we did a 3-week residency at somewhere called Binaural Nodar in north central Portugal. When did we get back? 2 or 3 weeks ago. But the piece, a bit like I was saying with Organ of Corti, has a much longer legacy, which I'll talk a little bit about. But has anybody, I can't really see, but has anybody heard of Binaural Nodar? Yeah. It's a very cool place, set up originally by 2 brothers, Luis and Rui Costa, who both had other jobs in Lisbon and decided that they would return to the village where they grew up in the mountains. And I mean, it seems like an incredible proposition. Set up an international art institution in these tiny villages. But the internationalism wouldn't come from them taking their work out and doing lots of travelling. It would come from people coming to them. So one of the first things that they did was to set up this residency program, which I think is varied in scale, but it's normally, I think, two things a year, something like that, where they take 4 to 6 artists who come and make work with them. And they normally make a call for work where they state some kind of a theme that they're interested in people exploring. So you have this quite intense situation where there's 5 or 6 artists living in a house together that are all ostensibly working towards the same theme, but they're coming from very different perspectives, and the artists tend to come from all over the world. And I think for Luis and Rui and Manuela, who also runs it now, the phonography, which is an essential part of the way in which they present what their organisation does, is nevertheless only a means to an end. It's very much based around an idea that's gained currency, I think, recently, of relational aesthetics. It's to do with the ways in which phonography and sound arts more generally can contribute to greater understanding between artists and communities, between different sections of the community, between young people understanding better where they live and the unique characteristics of their environment and so on. It's a tool, and I think it's fair to say, I hope they wouldn't mind me saying this, it's a strategic tool which is only as good as it is useful. The consequence of that is that I think quite a few of the artists felt a certain responsibility to that agenda, that you're going into a very different environment to the one that you normally work in, and dropping in for a relatively short period of time and making a piece which is supposed to be engaging with the landscape, with the community, and not simply making a piece of work that you could make in your studio back in the UK. And I felt quite anxious about that. We've done quite a bit of work that relates in different ways to communities in the past. And I think particularly when it's a stated part of what you're doing there are 2 dangers. One is that you don't engage enough and you make a piece of work that could seem arrogantly detached. It could seem like, well, you could have done that anywhere. What's the point of you coming here to do that? And I'm not just talking about whether or not you respond to issues of the site, but also to the broader issues of the context of working with those people. The other is that you bow too much towards that agenda, and you try and make these kind of affirmational pieces that become a bit like a kind of tourist piece, albeit through the lens or through the artistic languages of contemporary art. But actually all you're doing is saying, hey, aren't these people great, isn't this lovely? And kind of didn't want to do either of those 2 things. So we were really struggling, I think, to find a route that would both engage with the context in which we were working, culturally, topographically, acoustically, in terms of the overall soundscape of the place, that would involve people, but not felt very uncomfortable about that thing of an artist coming in that we're going to go again in 3 weeks. We can't pretend to have a long-term responsibility for the engagements that we have. So this theme, anyway, was to do with the relationship between sound and religion. That area of Portugal is still deeply Catholic, overwhelmingly so that the churches are still very much central to the way in which that community functions. And the call was specifically to engage with that theme. I'll just show you a map. Actually, I haven't got a map that shows Portugal, so it's not very useful unless you already know the region. But it's kind of north central. It only takes a couple of hours to get from Oporto, but it really is a different world when you're there. It's very, very high up. Most of the people that live there are subsistence farming, working very, very small patches of land, largely without the use of modern agricultural technology, largely cut off in terms of communication. So that was another kind of odd thing. We all knew that we were going to be presenting at the end of this 3-week residency, but we really wondered who was going to come, who was going to be interested in the kind of work that we might make. But come they did, and that was really interesting. So we ended up working with this church in a little town called Sul, and I'll just show you a couple more images of the church. That's the church inside. And what we proposed to do really stemmed back to a project that we'd done a few years ago, where we were working on a master plan in Birmingham. It was an area of Birmingham. I used to live in Birmingham. It always used to be called Digbeth, but now it's being called East Side. I think they're being a bit aspirational. And there was a development that was going to happen in this little area. It's a kind of quadrangle that's got water on 3 sides. And we were kind of involved in the master plan, looking at what role sound could have in master planning. So you think of the ways in which you can avoid nasty sounds. Acousticians tend to do that. We were more interested in looking at the ways in which sound could make a positive contribution to this development, or hypothetically to any development. Anyway, the project didn't happen, but that's not the point. In the course of doing this master plan, we were devising ways of getting all the different stakeholders, as people call them, to listen differently. So we devised sound walks, pre-recorded sound walks. That was quite successful. But the other thing that we started doing in this project was sound listening walks, we call them, where rather than giving people a pair of headphones and something to listen to, it's a guided walk where we do exercises, listening exercises. And I guess that was actually the genesis to the application to the Wellcome Trust. As we started devising listening exercises, you realise, okay, some of these listening exercises come from my own background training as a musician. They're ear training things. And some of them we've kind of learnt from audiologists that have taught us the kind of listening exercises they do in the diagnostic process. And some of them have come through hanging out with acousticians and listening to the way in which they listen, actually sometimes using some of the devices that they use to listen. And then, as a sound artist that engages with technology, you think, well, I also know that when I listen through microphones and hydrophones and contact mics, you listen differently again. So they're kind of interesting to throw into the equation too. And there are a whole set actually of listening exercises that were devised in the mid-70s with the World Soundscape Project, which were a more ecological agenda of listening to the unique characteristics of the place where you are. So we devised lots of these listening exercises. And this was a listening cycle ride, actually, that one. This is a mapping one where people are looking at the dot in the middle, imagining that to be yourself, and mapping where sounds are around you. That one is a kind of sensory deprivation one, a really simple thing to do, but quite effective actually in the way in which it changes the way you listen. This was on a workshop at London Met in field studies, which I highly recommend actually. It's a sort of summer school. And this was an intriguing one with us to do with some neuroscientists who were doing a summer school in the north of the Netherlands. And obviously the way in which they engaged with exercises was quite different. Anyway, one of the exercises that we wanted people to do was simply writing the sounds that they heard down over a 60-second period. Really, really simple thing to do. And quite by chance, we'd run this thing where people were in different places around our site in Birmingham. So there were people actually at the four corners of the site that we were working with. And they all wrote down what they did. And then, you share what you've got. Most of it is unique to where they are, because you're in a very, what Murray Schafer would call a lo-fi listening environment, where your acoustic horizon is not very far away most of the time. Most of what you're hearing is stuff that's within 6-7 meters of you. It's road traffic, it's your immediate environment. But certain things, coming from factories, really loud bangs, would permeate everybody's lists. Or a helicopter passing overhead would permeate everybody's list. And nearly all of those things were framed by the participants negatively. They were seen as pollution. They were seen as the loudest sounds which you couldn't escape from. And in certain cities, they've become kind of famous as problems. New York being a really good example, where helicopters are kind of often they're the bête noire of residents there, because there are simply so many. In London, I think people's relationship with air traffic again is similar. But those tend to be the only sounds that will permeate a wide area. Now, when it came to this call from binaural nodal, we thought it's interesting that in the context of an urban environment like that, those sounds that permeate a wide space are often framed negatively. And yet in the history of Western communities, and particularly around the church, it's not actually unique to the Christian church at all. But bells have been a really significant acoustic binding of communities. As I said, bells are not unique to Christianity. We find them in other traditions, particularly in China, and within Christianity in different contexts used in different ways. But they've been around for 1,000 years or so, and have often had that function of binding communities by calling people to worship, calling people to prayer, also as warnings and as announcements of different events taking place. Before they were used in churches, they were used in monasteries, where they still are used, not just to regulate those things, but to regulate time. So that in a monastery you have all these different bells for prime and compound and vespers and so on, that articulate the most minute periods of time in the day. And bells in that context are framed positively, and are framed as a way of binding a community together. So we thought, what if we used the church bell as our point of departure in this piece? So you'll notice already that our use of sound in this piece is very different from Organ of Corti, where Organ of Corti is entirely about materiality of sound. This is very much about the indexicality of sound. It's very much about the meaning of the sound. And the actual sound of the bell, as I say, this project's partway through, it's not something that we've engaged in anywhere near as deeply as the role of the sound and the meaning of the sound for the community in which it exists. But I'll just briefly explain our idea. It was to work with sound recordists, originally 4 sound recordists, but that became 8. So we worked with some kids who attended a Saturday school at the church. They kind of volunteered. They'd done stuff with binaural before, so they weren't completely new to working with artists, and they weren't new to working with technology either. The youngest of them was 9, and the oldest was, it kind of moved a bit actually. We did it a number of times, and on this occasion one of the mums was helping. I think the oldest child was only about 16. Most of them were at the younger age, but we doubled them up simply so that we could have a bit of latitude when we came to edit these. But what they did was we started outside the church. Let me see if I've got an image of them. Back to back. And we had great cooperation from the priest and the church. And we rang the bell. And they've all got recorders on, a bit like this one here, just little Zoom recorders and things. And they're standing back to back. So when we play the recordings at the beginning, it's a kind of quasi surround, and I'll play an example of it in a minute. But as they move on their respective journeys, they're walking north, east, south, and west, the recordings become more and more unique to the environment that they're in. And the only sound that permeates all of them is the bell. I say the only sound. There was one plane that went overhead. And because of the fact that it's such a quiet environment, occasionally a car will pass one of them, and it's still within earshot of another one. So you do hear these funny relationships. Just a quick PowerPoint a minute and play a little introductory movie. Ooh. I say it's in development. One of the outcomes is this film, which you're going to see 1 minute of. But it needs to be quite loud. So the installation occurred in the church itself, but we took these 4 recordings and put them on 4 pairs of loudspeakers, so 8 speakers, positioned equivalent to where the kids, the direction they're walking in. So you've got a pair north, a pair east, a pair south, and a pair west. And in the listening environment, each time the bell rings, and it wasn't a continuous ring, you hear the bell ring for that time, and then there's a period of a pause while all you hear is sort of footsteps and their unique journeys, and then the bell articulates the whole thing. What we were interested in is both the binding influence of the bell, the meaning of the bell in that context, but also of taking the phonosphere of the parish and collapsing it back into its epicenter. So the epicenter being the church, that respectively the original idea was that they'd keep walking until they couldn't hear the bell anymore. The age of the kids meant that wasn't really possible. As it was, they started going into woodland and all over the place. So we had some concerns. They were all very confident about where they were, and they all had permission to do it. But we couldn't have them walk for 3 or 4 hours until they went out of earshot of the bell. It wouldn't really be responsible. So we only did it in the end for 10 minutes. But it was both about them getting to the outer territory of the parish, and also about the listening experience for the people that came, folding all of that back in to the church, so that within the church building you're hearing these outer extremities of the parish itself. So I'll just play a couple of extracts if I've got time.
10 minutes?
10 minutes, yeah. And while it's playing, this is tricky, maybe I need to mirror. So before the walk, you just get a sense of this isn't going to quite work because we've only got 4 speakers, so I'm not using that one. So you have to imagine that's north, that's east, that's south, and that's west. But you do get that weird sense that you're hearing people talking, and all the recorders are hearing very similar things to one another. This is just.
Eu também não, para mim isso vai fazer.
Então venham para aqui. Vai da torre. Portanto, vocês ficam virados para o vosso local. Portanto, vão ficar tipo a fazer um quadrado, costas com costas, estão a ver? Portanto, dois. Ou seja, exato. Do mesmo grupo ficam lado a lado. Exatamente. Isso. Isso. E agora aqui.
So they're discussing where they're going there, and they're all that went on for quite some time. We decided to use that in the final installation. Kind of funny, and they really engaged with hearing their own voices and remembering what they were saying. I'll just play the first 4 minutes, which includes 2 iterations of the bell. And I think within that time you hear some of the strange artifacts that occur, because even when the bell is evenly distributed between the 4 recordings, as early on it was, you hear that some of them are actually further away from the source, so you get a kind of phasing effect because the sound is arriving at one recording before it's arriving at another. As the walk went on, there were periods in which the sound disappeared completely for one recording. So the sound image appears to gravitate towards one part of the room. And I think that's going to be a theme that we're going to pick up on as we develop the project, that within a parish there are these shadows in which you're not a parishioner anymore. This is an interesting idea. It comes from, I think Murray Schafer was one of the first to identify this, that in early definitions of what was a parish, both civil and spiritual, it was to do with the earshot of the bell. So if you could hear the bell, you were within that community. If you were outside the earshot of the bell, you were probably in another community, or perhaps in no community at all. And it's interesting the way in which the architecture of villages grouped houses together, partly for this spiritual belief that being within the earshot of the bell wasn't just something that bound you together as a community civilly, but also pre-Christian beliefs that bells actually had magical power to dispel demons, to break bad magic. So bells were not just about that communicative role, not just about that imperative role to come to worship, but they were all also believed to have a protecting power in and of themselves, which is a theme which didn't really get invoked through this installation, but it's one that we really want to pick up on as we do the film. So while this is playing, which will take us to the end, I think, I'll just click up a couple of images of the kids walking from behind, because the photographers were all chasing.
Shall we say it?
is always tricky using 5.1 when you're quite close to them. I don't know, probably only the people in the middle get a sense of the relationship between all four walks. But hopefully you could hear that the bell shifted slightly in its relationship to the room as they went in and out of earshot of it. But for the most part, in that early stage, it was present in all of them. But you do get these slightly phasing effects. I'll finish there, but just one of the things we didn't know before we went, which was really intriguing, is that the bells aren't actually used on the church very much. They're used for mass, and they're used for special occasions. But for the most part, they use recordings of bells, which is really funny. So the hour chimes are all through recordings. And I did quite a lot of interviews while we were there, and opinion differed wildly amongst people that I met one man on the street, and he saw my watch. He said, I've got to get inside before that horrible bell thing goes off. It's a travesty. And for other people, they obviously had quite a lot of affection for this recording, which wasn't a recording of that bell. It was a recording of, one of them was a recording of Big Ben, actually. So there are lots of other themes. And the other amazing use of the tannoy is that the mass itself is broadcast. So the priest uses a radio mic, and that, as well as going to the PA in the church, goes out across the valley, which was another really fascinating theme, the way in which, even if you don't go to church, you're still subject to the message coming from the church. So I'll leave it there. I think I've run over a little bit, but maybe we've got time.
What is the reason that they're using recordings?
I'm not I never really got to the bottom of why. Some people said it was to protect the bell, that the bell was so valuable they didn't want to wear it out. I find that kind of hard to believe. I think maybe they were introduced. Other people said that they were introduced at a time when it seemed like it was progress to use electric technology like that, and because it could be used for the transmission of the mass as well as for the bells, it seemed like it was a bold new future. And then people got used to it and liked it. I never really had a clear answer as to why they used it, because nearly all the places that they used it, there were real bells there that could have been used.
But it's not because of somebody has to ring it?
No, because that chime that we heard at the end was a combination of a swinging bell and a notched bell, both of which are now on electric mechanisms. It may be that the tannoy system came into use before they'd mechanised the bells, but I think they'd mechanised bells in the 1950s. I don't think it was, it's not so recent.
Perhaps it's inspiration from the Islamic world, where on the top of the mosque there's all this.
It could be. I mean, Portugal has more influence from the Islamic world than we do in the UK in that sense. That's a whole other theme, actually. I think a fellow Brightonian, David Hendy, talks about using the example of Istanbul as a great mixture of East and Western uses of bells, because most of the Islamic tradition, I think maybe all of it, doesn't use bells, so the call to prayer is always from the voice. But they adopted buildings that had bells, and the bells were silenced. It's a fascinating detour. That would be.
So we had probably some time for 2 questions, maybe, from the floor.
I can't see very well, actually.
Martin, light.
No questions.
Well, David will be with us for our little event. He's curious what you have produced as well. So you can, once a question pops up or you want to ask something more in detail, which you don't want to ask now, you can do that in the break during the afternoon. For now, thank you very much, David.
Thank you.
That was very
I'm really